morning, everybody. I'm very delighted to welcome you all here today. I'd like to especially acknowledge the presence of Professor the Honorable Gary Evans, former Foreign Minister of Australia, and the Chancellor of the Australian National University, Mr. Jin Won-che, the Korean Minister and Consul General to Australia. I also like to acknowledge the presence of Ms. Sojong Park, Director of the Korean Cultural Center, and the presence of many distinguished Korean studies scholars across all disciplines, including my many UniSA colleagues. Before I go any further, we have a tradition in South Australia that events such as this, we recognize the traditional owners of this land. This morning, I acknowledge that this ceremony is taking place on Ghana land. The Ghana people have performed the ceremonies on this land for many, many centuries, and we pay respect to their living culture and the unique role they continue to play in the life of the Adelaide region. Before we kick off the symposium and introduce our most honored guest today, Professor the Honorable Gary Evans, ACQC, I'd like to spend a few minutes on today's symposium. It is my great pleasure to be the first speaker at this important symposium today, and my honor for it to be hosted at UniSA. First, the significance of this symposium. Since the establishment of a diplomatic relationship between Australia and Korea in 1961, both countries have been very close allies and strategic partners. Korea is, as we all aware, is the Australia's fourth largest export market, and it is one of 6 countries that matter the most to Australia, along with China, India, Indonesia, Japan, and the United States. And since the establishment of the Korea-Australia Free Trade Agreement, so-called CAFTA, in 2014, we have seen multiple new opportunities strengthening this rapidly growing bilateral trade and investment relationship. Yet, while Australia's political economic relationship with Korea continues to grow, the public awareness, as we discussed in the taxi with Gareth this morning, public awareness of the importance of the Australia-Korea relationship is, as a matter of fact, underwhelming. According to Lowy Institute 2016 poll on the question of Australia's best friend in Asia, only 4% of Australians nominate Korea as Australia's best friend, compared with the 31% who nominate China, 28% who identify Japan, and the 15% who nominated Indonesia. Such unawareness is also mirrored in this land, in South Australia. Despite the rapid increase in our political, economic, and trade engagement with Northeast Asia, there is very still a significant lack of understanding and unconscious underestimation of the importance of Korea to our state, South Australia. Indeed, while the demand for a better understanding of Korea has significantly increased in South Australia over the past decade, it has not been matched by a sufficient supply of Korean studies-related programs, which is really concerning, given the importance of Korea to Australia. As such, this symposium, distinctively dedicated to strengthening our bilateral relationship, is timely, attended by leading experts like you guys in Australia-Korea relations. Such interactions not only fill the current void in South Australia, but also provide a tremendous opportunity to introduce and promote Australia-Korea relationship and Korean studies to the state and the wider members of the community. Today's symposium is made of 4 key sessions, sessions on such areas as security, migration, political economy, and business. Of course, we will, in a minute, have a keynote speech delivered by Professor Evans, who will comprehensively cover those areas. And I also like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. Jay Song from University of Melbourne, who is a co-organizer of this gathering. Dr. Song, as you know, has been working with all our honorable speakers, including Professor Evans, since the beginning of the planning stage. I truly appreciate your dedication, Dr. Song. And I acknowledge the wonderful support we have received in successfully planning, organizing, and executing this symposium. This wonderful event would not be possible without continuous and generous financial support from the Academy of Korean Studies, Australia-Korea Foundation, and I actually put special thanks also go to Senior Management Group of the UniSA, the School of Management, University of South Australia, Professor Murray Wilson, Pro-Vice Chancellor in the Faculty of Business and Law, Professor Ruth Rensler, the head of the School of Management, for their continuous and warm support for this symposium. And lastly, but certainly not least, UniSA School of Management team, Ling, Mel, Amy, and of course, Steve from the Deputy Vice Chancellor's Office, whose indispensable assistance and painstaking efforts in logistical preparation and day-to-day missions on symposium preparation right up to this very moment lead to the success of this symposium. I thank you all. And may I conclude by once again sincerely thanking all of you and asking each of you stay engaged, provocative, and proactive during the rest of the symposium. I look forward to hearing the outcomes of our very stimulating discussions. And thank you. And now, the most anticipated the talk for this symposium. Please let me brief on Professor the Honorable Gareth Evans. Professor Evans has been, as we know, the Chancellor of the Australian National University since January 2010. He was, as we know, the Cabinet Minister in the Hawke and Keating Labour governments from 1983 to 1996, in the post of Attorney General, Minister for Resources and Energy, Minister for Transport and Communications, and of course, from 1988 to 96, Foreign Minister. During his 21 years in Australian politics, Professor Evans was leader of the government in the Senate, 93 to 96, deputy leader of the opposition in the House of Representatives, 96 to 98. From 2000 to 2009, he was the president and the CEO of the Brussels-based International Crisis Group. Professor Evans is also a prolific writer. We just talked about his recent launch of his book. He was written and edited solely or jointly 13 books, including Incorrigible Optimists. Incorrigible Optimist sounds like me. Incorrigible Optimist, a political memoir, which was published in 2017. And Nuclear Weapons, The State of Play, 2015. Inside the Hawke Keating Government, A Cabinet Diary, 2014. And The Responsibility to Protect Ending Mass Atrocity Crimes Once and for All, 2008. So he's married to Dr. Maureen Evans, an econometrician who was formerly Pro-Vice Chancellor, Planning and Quality at Monash University in Melbourne. They have 2 adult children, Kathleen and Eamon, and 4 grandchildren. His leisure interests are reading and writing, travel, architecture, opera, golf, Australian rules football, you name it. Please join me in welcoming Professor the Honorable Gareth Evans.
Well, thank you, Professor Lee, you will, for that very extravagant and rather over-the-top introduction, as I often say on these occasions, reflecting something that was said by Adlai Stevenson when he was a candidate for the US presidency several decades ago. Flattery's all right as long as you don't inhale, but there we go. Well, look, Professor Lee, Consul General Jay Song, distinguished guests and participants, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here with you today. Let me right at the outset echo the opening remarks of UIL. Australia-South Korea relations, although strong, have never quite reached their full potential, and it's time they did. economically, maybe, but people to people definitely need more. And above all, given the fraught and very fragile regional environment, strengthening relationship in political and security terms. So that'll be the theme of my talk today, taking each of those areas in turn, with a particular focus, as you might expect, on the security and strategic dimensions. I hope that in doing so, I will be very much reflecting the concerns and preoccupations that have brought you together for this very important, jointly sponsored symposium. So thanks again for the organisers for inviting me to join you. The strength of the relationship with South Korea has had its ups and downs. The downs, I guess, mainly associated with concerns on our side about human rights issues, not least the threatened execution of Kim Dae-jung in 1980 during the South Korea's less democratic periods, now thankfully well in the past. But certainly with diplomatic relations firmly established since the early 1960s, economic ties developing rapidly since then, our relations with the South have always obviously been in much better shape than our ties with the relentlessly and consistently authoritarian North. We didn't get off to a very good start with the North when we fought against them in the war of 1950-53, committing more than 17,000 troops, of whom 340 were killed, to join the UN forces supporting the South. And things really haven't improved all that much since. Diplomatic relations have been very erratic, economic relations almost non-existent. Australia-DPRK diplomatic relations weren't established, in fact, till 1974, and then they were abruptly suspended the following year when, in response to a perceived slight from us in the United Nations, the details of which seem to be utterly lost in the mists of time, North Korea abruptly withdrew its mission from Canberra and expelled our mission from Pyongyang. Indeed, and some of you will be familiar, I guess, with this story, so abrupt was the withdrawal, the story goes, that one flustered North Korean official crashed his car on the way to the airport, and rushing into the nearest house for assistance, he found that his would-be Good Samaritan was in fact the South Korean ambassador. It wasn't until 2000 that Australia resumed diplomatic relations through our embassy in Beijing, with Pyongyang reopening its embassy in Canberra in 2002, only to close it again in 2008. So the diplomatic relations do continue, now conducted through our mission, the DPRK's embassy in Jakarta and our mission in Seoul. But the relationship is obviously very much constrained by our deep concerns, along with everybody else's, over North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile programs, an issue which I'll come back to later. Well, let's begin with economics. The strongest dimension, of course, of our relationship with South Korea is unquestionably the economic one. We do have similar-sized economies, with South Korea's $1.4 trillion economy, US dollar economy, ranking 11th, and our $1.2 trillion economy, currently ranking 14th in the world on the latest World Bank GDP figures on current prices. And the ROK, as everyone here will know, is very well established as Australia's fourth largest trading partner after China, the United States and Japan. The share of our trade, our total trade, is only 4.8%, but it's been on a steady growth trajectory, whereas Japan's share, by contrast, has been declining. We have mainly exported commodities, iron ore, coal, beef, sugar, wheat, getting back mainly manufactures, in return cars, electronics, machinery, but education and tourism are making a big and growing contribution to our exports, and the biggest upside, I guess, for the future does remain in services in those areas in particular. A less comforting side of the trade story is that while the Korea-Australia Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA, which has already been mentioned, is a substantial achievement, it really doesn't seem to have been given the prominence or treated with the significance in the minds of Australian businesses of the companion agreements with China and Japan, which were negotiated around the same time. I may have missed something, but my sense overall, reinforced by some further conversations as recently as earlier this morning, my sense overall is that South Korea just has not been seen as familiar to Australians as China and Japan have long been, and that does need to be remedied. Most obvious weakness in our economic relationship is investment, which from Australia into Korea is less than negligible, a little bit more substantial coming back the other way, but not a great story. Although I have to say that's not something unique to Korea. It's the same story really all over Asia, as our businesses remain far more comfortable investing in the United Kingdom, the US and New Zealand than they seem to be doing anywhere in Northeast, Southeast or South Asia. So if the Australia-Korea relationship is to get the wider attention it deserves, particularly from the business community and the wider community, at least part of the answer does clearly have to be building the people-to-people dimension of that relationship. There are some foundations on which to build in the 200,000 Koreans in Australia and around 30,000 Australians in South Korea at any given time. But most Koreans are here only temporarily as tourists or students, and the overall numbers are really quite small as compared with some of our other key Asian relationships. In the case of education, for example, the latest figures for international student enrolments released just this week show just over 4,000 Koreans here for higher education, 18,000 overall, as compared with China's 120,000 for higher education, 170,000 overall, India's 47,000, 63,000 respectively. Obviously, Korea's got nothing like the population base of the big two, and Korea does still rank 7th overall for international enrolments. But it is, I think, a little bit disappointing to see South Korea listed below countries still like Nepal and Brazil. So there are plenty of challenges for the Australia-Korea Foundation and others working to give real human dimension, weight and substance to our relationship, not only in quantitative terms but also qualitative. I know the effort is being made. When I was in Seoul recently, just middle of last month, for a nuclear conference, Plaza Hotel there seemed to be half full of a diverse and really very interesting collection of quite high-level Australians there, I think on a Australia-Korea Foundation sponsored visit. But still more obviously needs to be done, and I hope very much that that's a topic that you address really systematically and fully in today's symposium. The political, diplomatic and security dimension of our relationship is potentially, I think, the most important of all, given the dynamics currently in play in the region and the wider world. With China manifestly no longer willing to observe Deng Xiaoping's injunction to bide its time and hide its strength, with the United States giving totally confused and confusing signals about the nature and intensity of its future engagement with the region, and of course developments on the Korean Peninsula itself generating enormous world attention right now. There are quite firm foundations on which we can build our relationship in this geopolitical space. It was, after all, Prime Minister Hawke's visit to Seoul in January 1989 that saw the conception of the APEC process, which was born after that conception in Canberra 10 months later at a conference which I chaired as then Foreign Minister. And I remember very well personally how closely and productively South Korean and Australian ministers and officials worked together as APEC evolved over the next few years, first in finding a way of embracing Taiwan as well as China in the process, and then in adding a leaders' meeting to the institutional framework of this really quite centrally important regional cooperation initiative. I also remember very well participating, albeit as a marginal rather than central player, in the agreed framework and CAIDO negotiations in the mid-1990s, which was, as you remember, the first serious attempt to deal with the prospect of North Korean nuclear weapons capability. The status of each of us as firm allies of the United States helped then, as it still does now, in building trusting and constructive working relationships between us, but there was, there still is, and there will be in the future, I think, more to our political and security relationship than just that, the relationship between us as mutual allies of the US. These cooperative diplomatic exercises in the past have in more recent years been given stronger institutional backup. The 2009 Joint Statement on Enhanced Global and Security Cooperation of Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and President, as he then was, Lee Myung-bak, resulted in an action plan embracing regular reciprocal ship and aircraft visits, enhanced bilateral exercises, inter-service and defence policy talks, military intelligence sharing, and military intelligence sharing arrangements, which have since then been further spelt out in the 2015 Blueprint for Defence and Security Cooperation. Since 2013, very importantly, we've had in place 2+2 bilateral dialogue meetings with our foreign and defence ministers from each side coming together. And on a wider plurilateral front, we've also had since 2013 the establishment, initiated by South Korea, of MICTA, that group of Mexico, India, Korea, Turkey and Australia, which brings together this very geographically diverse group of G20 members to informally consult and try to bridge divides on global issues like development, cyber and nuclear security, climate change and the environment. Whether we can translate this steadily growing and intensifying set of relationships into any meaningful role for Australia in the forthcoming North Korea nuclear negotiations remains to be seen. We played, as I've already mentioned, a bit part in the past in the agreed framework negotiations in the mid-90s, contributing to meeting the North's energy needs, which was part of the hoped-for settlement then, and I guess we could again contribute in that way. Again, we participated in the investigation into the 2010 sinking of the Cheonan by North Korea, and could again, I guess, contribute to international monitoring and verification processes that will clearly need to be part of any denuclearisation settlement, or indeed steps along the way to denuclearisation, like an agreed freeze on weapons and delivery systems development and fissile material production. But clearly, when it comes to the negotiations themselves, if they don't implode before they get seriously started, we realistically can't expect to play anything more than a bystander role. The central players will be, of course, two Koreas, the United States, China, to a less extent the other two six-party talks participants, Japan and Russia. I should say, I guess, in relation to the forthcoming summitry, that it is to the enormous credit of President Moon Jae-in and his officials that things have come as far and as fast as they have, with the Olympics initiative being followed by some very deft diplomacy in creating the conditions for President Trump to be able to agree to meet with Kim Jong-un, albeit as impetuous and unexpected and uninformed by knowledge and advice as that agreement undoubtedly was. While there is intense uncertainty and nervousness about how things will unfold in the weeks ahead, I've always believed, incorrigible optimist that I am, that a sustainable deal is doable with Pyongyang, as ugly and indifferent to normal ethical constraints as that regime undoubtedly is. And I have to say I'm reinforced in that view after 2 days of discussions, including with senior officials very close to the Blue House, when I was in Seoul last month. I found then very clear support for the analysis that Kim's basic intentions are above all defensive rather than aggressive, that he is focused on regime survival and knows that to be homicidal is to be suicidal, that he genuinely wants a deal. In that context, the prevailing South Korean government view, and for what it's worth, my view, is that Kim, yes, is unlikely in the short to medium term to commit to anything more than a freeze on fissile material production and the development and testing of both weapons and delivery systems, knowing, as he must, that any such freeze would have to be deep and comprehensive and fully verifiable to have a chance of being accepted. But there is also a view in the present government, South Korean government, which I share, that Kim's ultimate agreement to full denuclearisation of the North, without an accompanying impossible demand that the ROK remove itself entirely from extended US deterrence, there is a view that that's not impossible in the context, at least, of the long-sought conclusion of the Korean War Peace Treaty, normalisation of diplomatic relations, and the development over time of some genuine trust between the DPRK and its neighbours, above all the United States. The question that has us all still on the edge of our seats is whether, If this is in fact the way that North Korea's position sort of sequentially emerges, the United States will in fact be capable of taking yes for an answer. What, if anything, is in President Trump's head, and will be on the day, remains a complete mystery. It's not a secret, it's a mystery. One can't help but be reminded in this respect of what the quote that I can't help myself repeating on these occasions, can't help but be reminded of what the speechwriter Peggy Noonan is reported to have said about President Reagan. Quote, the battle for the mind of Ronald Reagan was like the trench warfare of World War I. Never have so many fought so hard for such barren ground. But the trouble is that whereas, of course, Reagan had around him grounded and very competent people like George Shultz and James Baker to save him from himself, Trump now has Pompeo, and most alarmingly of all for anyone who's had any dealings at all with him, as I have, John Bolton, with Defence Secretary Mattis, I guess the only remaining adult anywhere near the room. I know John Bolton. I've worked with John Bolton. John Bolton is no diplomat. He's relentlessly stubborn and destructive ideologue. For him, give and take negotiation is for wimps, and he's never seen a proposal, to my knowledge, for coercive military action that he hasn't liked. So we are going to have to be on the edge of our seats, I think, for a good while yet. While Australia can't expect to be more than a bit player on all these North Korea issues, I am persuaded that there's a great deal we can and should be doing together with South Korea in the general area of middle power diplomacy. Making this point will require me to say something first about what I mean by middle powers and middle power diplomacy. Middle powers are best described as those states which are not economically or militarily big or strong enough, either in their own regions or the wider world, to impose their policy preferences on anyone else, but which are nonetheless sufficiently capable and credible and motivated to be able to make an impact on international relations. There's no standard list of current middle powers or any commonly agreed list of objective measures like population or GDP or military budgets to distinguish military powers from others. But that list would certainly include Australia and South Korea and the other members of the MICTA group, Mexico, India, Indonesia, Turkey, as it would Canada and most of the Scandinavians. A better, and I think not at all necessarily circular, although it might sound that way of identifying middle powers is to describe middle powers as states which practice middle power diplomacy. And what that means, I think, is practicing a diplomacy which has two characteristics, characteristic motivation and a characteristic method. The characteristic motivation is a belief in the utility and the necessity of acting cooperatively with others in addressing international challenges, particularly those global or regional public goods problems which by their nature can't be solved by any country acting alone, however big and powerful that country may be. And the characteristic diplomatic method is coalition building with like-minded states, those who, whatever their prevailing value systems, do share specific interests and are prepared to work together to do something to advance them. The contributions that middle powers so acting can make to better international relations include agenda setting, bringing new ideas to the table which bigger players carrying too much baggage or too stuck in their own ways to embrace don't often do. For example, in our own region, the creation of APEC, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and the Australia-Indonesia initiated peace plan for Cambodia. Also includes bridge building between developed and developing countries, one of the major aspirations of the MICTA group, to which I've already referred. Another contribution middle powers can make is, of course, to build critical masses of support for global or regional public goods and rule-based order policy change. For example, climate change, the responsibility to protect R2P against mass atrocity crimes, arms control treaties like those abolishing cluster bombs, landmines, and also hopefully now nuclear weapons elimination, although some of the key middle powers, I have to say, give greater weight to being United States allies than being good global citizens. How effective middle powers can be in making a difference does depend on a number factors, including, to briefly list them, resources. You do need a reasonably wide network of diplomatic posts and officials with ability, energy and stamina to man them, or occupy them, we now should gender neutrally say. You need creativity. What middle powers lack in economic, political or military clout, they can often make up for with quick diplomatic footwork, evident again in the Asian region and the creation of new economic and security architecture and the APEC, ARF, the East Asian Summit and Cambodia Peace Plan, I guess. Credibility is another requirement. You do need to avoid hypocrisy by practicing at home what you preach abroad when it comes to these public goods. I fear that within MICTA, Turkey is in rather dangerous terrain here of losing that credibility on democracy and human rights issues. Indonesia is also going to have to take very great care with the issue of rising intolerance, Islamist intolerance of others. Allies of great powers in this sense, this context, like Australia, have to be perceived as having some real independence, not just acting as a cipher or stalking horse for the big protector. And the final requirement, of course, if you're going to make a middle power diplomacy kind of difference, is opportunity. And while there have been many past examples in our region of effective middle power diplomacy, and I've given some, we do have to recognise that in an Asian setting where great or major power rivalry, above all now between China and the US, but also Japan and China and India and Pakistan further afield, does provide so much of the context and the dynamics. And in that context, with those dynamics, the scope for middle power is to be really influential on the big peace and security issues in particular may be limited. But while recognising the reality of limited opportunity, let me offer nonetheless 3 examples where the middle powers of our region, very much including both Australia and South Korea, could, in my judgment, have a significant international relations impact. First of all, in setting the agenda for the East Asia Summit, which has all the ingredients to become the preeminent regional dialogue and policy-making body, containing, as it does now, all the major regional players, including now as well the United States and Russia, meeting as it does at leader level and mandated as it is to address both economic and political issues. Its 18 members include, in fact, a majority of what we might describe as middle powers, most of the ASEANs, Australia, South Korea, perhaps in that context as well New Zealand, because at least of its tradition of multilateral activism, if not its size. Second suggestion, in visibly pushing back against excessive Chinese assertiveness and overreach, including in the South China Sea, and apparently some news report this morning of Australian naval vessels being challenged by China, at least on the radio, when they are transiting part of the South China Sea. So this is a continuing, very real issue. While China manifestly doesn't want to provoke violent conflict anywhere, it's clearly intent on recreating as much of the historic hegemonic tributary relationship with its southern and perhaps eastern neighbours as it can get away with. And a united front of middle powers might be more effective in resisting this than simply relying on an increasingly erratic United States. There's been much talk in Australia of the Quad in this respect, the idea of India, Australia, Japan and the United States showing a united front diplomatically and to some extent militarily with joint exercises and the like. And I don't oppose continuing to cautiously develop that cooperation. But I have to say I'm much more attracted in this context to developing such a united front grouping which would harness the collective middle power energy and capacity of a number of regional states of real substance. For example, including India, Australia and Japan, but joined by South Korea, Indonesia and Vietnam. I don't know whether President Moon is yet thinking in these terms, but his visit last month to Vietnam, the ROK's largest economic partner in Southeast Asia, has, I've seen, been described by some analysts as a foray into just that kind of regional middle power coalition building. We'll see. Thirdly, some of us are in a position to influence if not necessarily the Korean nuclear issue, certainly the global nuclear weapons elimination debate. And I think we should do more than we have in this respect. Had South Korea and Australia, along with our larger neighbour Japan, been willing a few years ago to support President Obama's move towards a no first use doctrinal commitment, the world might have taken a very significant step towards reducing the salience and the legitimacy of what I continue to regard as the most indiscriminately inhumane and existentially threatening weapons ever invented. Although we have to acknowledge that the support of Central and Eastern European and NATO allies would probably have also been necessary to get Obama across the line. There is also, in the global nuclear weapons debate context, a very big job to be done in bridging the gap which manifestly now exists between, on the one hand, those who will settle only for the kind of absolutism embodied in the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty just recently negotiated and concluded in the UN in New York, and on the other hand, the nuclear armed states, and rather too many of those thinking that they shelter under the protection of the nuclear armed states, who want essentially no movement at all on disarmament. Working for a meaningful and achievable halfway house solution with a credible, not incredible, roadmap towards ultimate elimination is a task in which I think, without spilling out any of the more detail, which I can, it's a task in which I think Australia and South Korea can both be quintessentially important players, and I look forward to that happening, at least with the change of government at our end in the not too distant future. Forget about it until then, but that's another story. Raw economic and political power will always, of course, count for a lot in international affairs, but it doesn't count for everything. Middle powers, with a sense of where they want to go, and with the credibility and the resources and the energy to follow through, can have a major impact in making this region and the wider world safer and saner. This is a challenge for both South Korea and Australia, and I believe that working ever more closely together to strengthen the many bonds we already share, we can deliver on that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gareth. It's a fantastic and very stimulating and very exciting talk. And we now open to the audience Q&A, about 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, then we're going to have the tea break.
May I come back to looking forward, Gareth? Take about 2035. The role of the big protector may be quite different because of demographic change and economic change. The role of China and India may be quite different. And we are a continent in Asia, always looking to Northern Hemisphere big protectors. That may not be our future. So would you mind casting forward your eye in the context of where we sit with Korea as a middle power and think of some ideas? And second question is the erratic nature of America leadership at this point of time may be acceptable to the current government, but may require a more gentle approach by perhaps a changed government, a Labor government. And would you hesitate to give us your views on how they might best manage that repositioning of Australia?
Well, very big and interesting questions. The way I'd answer both of them is the way I often do when asked about this. And my general position looking forward for Australia is less United States, more Asia, and more self-reliance. When I say less United States, I don't mean walking away completely from the ANZUS alliance, because it has served us very well, obviously, in terms of intelligence, logistics support, and there is some kind of comfort, I guess, in some conceivable contingencies that the US will be there for us if we suffer some existential threat, which we, with all the self-reliance in the world, may not be able to manage by ourselves. But we have to look to a future in which the United States is just going to be, whether it's Trump or anyone else, where the US is just going to be less of a dominant, influential player, and unequivocally recognised as such in the way that it has been for the last few decades. So that's that part of it. The more Asia part has a number of different dimensions. It certainly means approaching our relationship with China, the big boy on the block, in a thoughtful and consistent way, not just thinking about it as a one-dimensional economic relationship which somehow is always going to have to be traded against our security concerns, and hopefully we can avoid a zero-sum game. I think we do have to think about our relationship with China in much more multi-dimensional terms. And to me, the secret of having a better and stronger relationship with China is focusing again on this good international citizen, this public goods space. Because I haven't given up at all on the notion of China as a serious, responsible stakeholder in the wider stage. Yes, there's an element of cynical opportunism in the way in which they jumped in on climate change when America abdicated that space. Yes, there's an element of cynical opportunism in the way that Xi Jinping has become the great spokesman for global free trade at Davos, again when the Americans sort of abdicate that kind of role. But that said, I've had a lot of dealing with Chinese officials on a whole bunch of issues over the years, including responsibility to protect and so on. That issue where you would expect them to be very uptight about anything which is inherently sovereignty invasive conceptually, but and maybe things will change if Xi Jinping moves into ever more authoritarian mode, but I'm more optimistic again that China sees real advantage in being an internationally seriously regarded, respected participant in the delivery of public goods right across that spectrum of issues, from arms control and disarmament to health pandemics and God knows what else. It's just a reality that we should be prepared to acknowledge the possibility of, rather than making assumptions for the worst. The other point about more Asia is that I do believe it is a matter of much more self-conscious solidarity building, united front building with the other major middle power type players in the region. Probably difficult with ASEAN as a collectivity. We talk about possible membership of ASEAN or some quasi-membership, some close association. But ASEAN's a difficult entity as such to deal with Cambodia and Laos already being wholly owned subsidiaries of China, and Malaysia well on the way to becoming there, and problems all over the place. But the Indonesias and the Vietnams are major players in their own right with an awful lot of clout and capability. And I really think we should be spending a lot of time and effort to build that sense of collective strength, and being willing to push back through freedom of navigation operations and so on. When China overreaches, there's always the risk when you get involved in this sort of stuff that small incidents will escalate into large ones. But again, here's where my optimism sort of cuts in. I think it's the last thing in the universe that China wants is any kind of major conflict. It doesn't see any advantage for itself. It'll fight tooth and nail if there's any suggestion of Taiwan moving away, or fight tooth and nail over Xinjiang or over Tibet. But the notion that it will fight tooth and nail to win territorial space of its own further south, it'll take what it can get by default. Will take what it can get when people allow it to take what it can get by not pushing back. But I think it'll be very cautious about trying to push the envelope too far. So this is the context in which I respond to that question. I mean, if the Americans were smart, they would be approaching this in a similar sort of way of not, and again, many of you probably heard me say this, but I mean, the smartest thing I've ever heard said about where America should be going with the tectonic plates shifting as they are in the world is from Bill Clinton a couple of years after he left the presidency, when I heard him at a small private gathering which we were both participating, I heard him say in a way that I've never heard him say it publicly since. It's not on the public record. He said, there's two choices America has as to how we use this great, and then, this was back in 2002, just after he left the presidency, two choices as to the way in which we exercise this great and as then unrivaled economic and military power. One is to use it to try to stay top dog on the global bloc in perpetuity. The other choice is to use that power to create a world in which we are comfortable living when we are no longer top dog on the global bloc. That sense that the future had to be one of cooperation rather than inevitable confrontation, that there was nothing permanently ordained about American dominance, leadership, primacy, and that you just had to allow some space certainly in the global rule-making business. You can't just expect countries like China to be rule takers in perpetuity. That's a message which has not been given by the United States, even under the Obama administration. I mean, famously, Obama said in the context of TPP, we make the rules. China doesn't make the rules, we make the rules. Obama said this, for God's sake. And, when that sort of message comes from that kind of presidency, God help us with the messaging we're getting from the present one. So, but things, if that culture does change, that outlook changes, then I think the future is much more, rosy and optimistic than a lot of people want to paint it. And I think our place in that future can be one of genuine, active, engagement and quite a lot of comfort in a way that people are much more pessimistic about at the moment than I tend to be. Sorry, we're not talking much about Korea, are we? But
you mentioned a middle power and how it becomes effective and noticed. You look for the way we engage and perhaps continuity in what we do. If you reflect on what others think of Australia and the way we practice our democracy, and in recent times how we've struggled to keep a consistent message internally, let alone externally, are we in danger of losing our influence, the way we created APEC, etc., if we don't realise that we've got to have some continuity in what we do? Is our democracy too robust for this type of engagement?
Yeah, well, I think there's some real truth in that. There's been a real pantomime quality to Australian democracy over the last few years, 5 prime ministers, as many years and so on, and that has not exactly gone unnoticed. But I think even more significant than that has been the soft power implications of doing what we're doing in Manus and Nauru, which I think is wildly understated by the present government. It just doesn't acknowledge, even if it understands, the amount of backroom comment about Australia's behaviour that I hear as I move around. I still move around a fair bit, UN corridors and other sorts of international places, and we have not done ourselves any good at all. So if you want to be a middle power and you want to do this global and regional public good stuff, as I said, you've got to do it without evident hypocrisy, and you've got to do it with some credibility in terms of your own standards, whether it goes to the quality of your behaviour on those sorts of self-evident moral issues, or whether it goes simply to the quality of your own governance system. We badly need to get back to some stable and serious and evidence-based policy making and less vaudeville posturing than has been the norm for so long. But I would say that, wouldn't I, as a Hawke Keating government sort of graduate. But the golden years, where are they? But I think we can recreate them.
We take one last word.
Yes.
It has to be one question.
With the Chair's indulgence, Gareth Ewan Graham from Lowy. I'm going to provoke your incorrigible optimism with a bit of provocative pessimism. South Korea at the moment is still under the deterrent, extended deterrent framework of the United States, but in my view, it's probably the most likely of the US Pacific allies to reconsider that under different strategic circumstances. Now we have the glass half full of the upcoming summit, but let's cast the clock forward. If South Korea does decide, and it's not beyond the realms of possibility, to acquire its own independent nuclear deterrent, it is now in the political mainstream. The main opposition party is actually committed to it as a platform. What would the implications be for Australia's cooperation between those two middle powers if Australia were a non-nuclear state? And are there any strategic circumstances that you can foresee under which Australia would also reconsider its non-nuclear policies?
Well, it'd be an extremely serious and unhappy development if the South Koreans were to go down the particular path, and I do acknowledge what you say, that domestic opinion polling and so on does show unhappily large numbers, willing to contemplate that, whether it's US nuclear weapons coming back onto South Korean soil, or even more alarmingly, I guess, the creation of a domestic nuclear weapon. I have some sort of confidence from talking to my friends and colleagues in the current administration that there's more huff and puff than substance in this, and that most South Koreans, when you really scratch them, are pretty, unwilling to go down that particular path, and that they do see it as not adding anything much more to their capacity, for defence. They've been living, after all, and this comes through in every conversation, as you must know, with South Koreans, that they've been living forever under the threat of the ring of fire around Seoul, the rockets and the artillery. And I think the perception is that if North Korea really were determined and had been determined to behave aggressively, that could have happened long since. It doesn't need the new acquisition of nuclear weapons capability to add to that threat. And there's been a sort of remarkable insouciance, about that. I mean, and I don't know whether you saw that opinion poll. The last one was a few months ago, which said that 65% of South Koreans saw Donald Trump as a greater threat to their security than Kim Jong-un, because of the prospect that Trump would, launch a preemptive war which would generate an explosive conflict in which citizens of Seoul would be the beneficiaries in the first instance. So, I mean, I think there are other factors there at work which, notwithstanding the fact that this is far closer to the visible surface in South Korea than it is, for example, in Japan, where nuclear armament is very much an extreme minority taste, and the culture, post Hiroshima and so on is essentially very, very negative about that, and I think will remain so, even if successive Japanese governments, say they hate nukes but actually love them in the context of the umbrella deterrent. So, I mean, I'm not sure that, that it's quite as serious as it seems, the prospect of that, and because because the reaction of the rest of the world to South Korea going down that path would be pretty strong. As to whether Australia would ever feel inclined to go down that path, I can't see that happening. Yes, there is a sort of a psychological comfort blanket feeling about nuclear weapons in many countries around the world, which, when you scratch it and pull it apart and analyse it, doesn't have much rational justification, but nonetheless there is some political momentum associated with it. But we're so implausibly the target of a nuclear attack. I mean, maybe Pine Gap or whatever, yes, but I don't think there's any context in which Australians at large would feel themselves so threatened that that sort of psychological political imperative would cut in to the point where governments of any stripe or colour, even one led by Peter Dutton, would feel obliged to to go down that path. So I just don't see that happening. So, but a lot of other things have got to play out in this before we can be confidently assertive about anything. But by and large, I am and remain an incorrigible optimist.